got Devil May Cry, the action game that I adore so much, or at least the series I adore so much, that basically left such a splash. Every other series wanted to be Devil May Cry. God of War, every other hack and slash action game out there. But it wasn't always this way, as Devil May Cry is actually a Resident Evil 4 prototype that turned into an action game along its development cycle.
Yeah, if you weren't already aware by literally anyone else talking about this game or Resident Evil 4, Devil May Cry is the result of Hideki Kamiya's first draft of Resident Evil 4, where he wanted to focus more on action and a cool protagonist called Tony Redgrave in the conceptuals.
Take a shot every time I say Resident Evil 4 in this video.
When Capcom received word of how much more action-focused this game was and how far in development it had gone, they told Kamiya that this wouldn't work as a Resident Evil game, but that shouldn't deter him from using it for something else, so Kamiya turned this Resident Evil 4 into what we now know as Devil May Cry, Tony Redgrave turning into the demon hunter Dante, along with the story getting overhauled to focus on demon slaying, with Dante being the son of the legendary Dark Knight Sparta. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of scrapped content. Thanks to the HD collection available on basically everything except the Nintendo Switch for some reason, you can see all this extremely intricate concept art for multiple unused areas and enemies in the game, ranging from this fish-like enemy to something akin to a kraken, not to mention a boatload of environmental art. Looking through all the concept art, it's even easier to tell that Devil May Cry used to be Resident Evil 4. Well, let's not talk about that anymore, what Devil May Cry was, but rather what it is now.
While I do have a special place for this game personally, I am going to see the entire game from start to finish on normal hard mode. Dante Must Die. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that for the future games, fair warning, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So, without further ado...
Let's rock, baby.
The game starts with a whole spiel on the legendary Dark Knight Sparta, which is extremely difficult to read with subtitles on, surprisingly, while conveniently leaving out the fact that he had twin sons, one of them being Dante. Dante runs a demon hunting gig at his shop, lined with trophies of past jobs, when Trish, this lady on the motorbike, crashes in and basically assaults and tries to murder Dante. All this was just to make sure he was the son of Sparta, like the attitude and numerous trophies didn't already give that away. Trish then informs Dante that the big demon rival of his father, Mundus, is attempting to return on Malay Island, so Trish and Dante venture there, and together they try and stop Mundus. Or I should say, Dante tries to stop Mundus' revival, because Trish basically ditches Dante before the first mission even starts. Fantastic. From this point on, the story takes a major backseat as Dante explores Malay Island, the castle, Colosseum, and everywhere else on the island, including these annoying underwater sections that really feel like leftovers from when DMC was an RE4 prototype. Throughout the castle portion of the game, and after you permanently defeat a few bosses, Trish shows up to congratulate you before revealing that she's actually working for Mundus! Who could have seen that coming? Once you get to the underworld area, Trish turns on you while you're fighting another boss, Nightmare, who I'll talk more about later, and then after Nightmare is defeated, Dante saves Trish from falling debris. She asks him why he saved her, and Dante replies with,
Because you look like my mother.
Okay, first of all I need to talk about this voice work. The voices in DMC1 are either extremely wooden, passable, or are at porno level of quality, and there is no in between. That is, we can even understand some of this without subtitles thanks to both horrible sound mixing and the distortion effects on some voices. After Dante and Trish go their separate ways, Mundus ends up putting Trish on display to taunt and distract Dante to try and kill him, though Trish escapes Mundus' containment, sacrificing herself to save Dante. Afterwards, Dante defeats Mundus, and he, plus a somehow alive Trish, escape Malay Island on a biplane that is very reminiscent of the jet ski from Resident Evil 4. Once they escape, Trish promotes herself to Dante's sidekick, along with changing the name of Dante's shop to Devil Never Cry. And considering that Dante changes the name back almost immediately after, I'm going to take a wild guess that that name was horrible for business. In terms of the whole story in general, it's passable, but it's absolutely nothing outstanding, especially for how bare bones it is. Then again, there's not much focus on story in general in action games like this one, so maybe this started that unfortunate trend. Speaking of the gameplay though, let's get started on that. Devil May Cry is given a mission structure for how the pace of the game runs. Each mission is usually 5 to 10 minutes long, some featuring boss fights while others don't. You're also ranked after each mission for how quickly you run through it, along with how many red orbs you collect, which can be used for either red orb gates or upgrading your abilities and buying items from these divinity statues. Then there's the secret missions. There's 12 of them in the entire game, each except the final one holding a blue orb fragment to collect. And these like heart pieces from Zelda, specifically Majora's Mask. The secret missions themselves can range from getting a critical hit on a specific enemy with a specific weapon, dealing with a specific enemy type within a time limit, or just finding the blue orb fragment, which in New Game Plus runs are replaced with yellow orbs. Sometimes secret missions can be an absolute pain to go through, especially for 2 secret missions that only let you attempt them once on a single save file. If you happen to die in a mission, you will either have to restart the mission from the last save point, or use a yellow orb to start back at the room you were just outside of. Since DMC is an action game first and foremost, all of these locations are really just set dressing for you to kill demons, preferably with style, which for this game basically means keeping an extraction and growling rather than actually being stylish with different attack combos. You can spam moves like Stinger or keep an enemy in midair with Ebony and Ivory, just watch the style never go to at least A without any effort. How you fight in DMC is a bit simplistic, but it is rather intuitive. You have the attack button that swings your sword, and the swings change depending on how rapidly you press the button. Pressing it quickly will do a 3-hit combo, while waiting about half a second will do a 5-hit combo, and waiting even longer will have Dante do a rapid piercing motion. Then there's a lock-on directional actions like High Time and Stinger, with High Time launching your enemy onto the air, and yourself as well if you hold down the button, while Stinger is a gap closer that you get after unlocking what essentially becomes your default weapon, a Laster. Yeah, weapon variety is a bit lacking in DMC 1 as all you have are 3 different types of swords, one which you should never use after getting a Laster, and the one different type of weapon, Ifrit, which is a fistfighter weapon. The unique thing about Ifrit compared to the Laster is that it's based on charging attacks rather than inputting at different frequencies. Personally, I stick with the Laster since I feel Ifrit is a little too context-sensitive of a weapon sometimes. Of course, some of this can change with a press of the double trigger. Activate this, and you can power through some enemy attacks to dish out even more damage while also regenerating your health. On top of that, you can get perks depending on your equipped weapon, like stronger projectiles or this Inferno move for Ifrit, or turning yourself into a vortex for a Laster. Though there is the Devil Sword Sparta that doesn't even let you use Double Trigger outside of the final boss fight. Yeah. You can upgrade Ifrit to the Laster at these Divinity statues that I mentioned earlier, letting you spend red orbs that you find from defeating enemies in the game and from locations or destructible objects for different and or stronger moves. I may as well get into the basic enemies of the game now that I've gone over essentially everything else. You have the Marionettes and Bloody Marys, which are basically the most common mook demon that you'll come across in the game, though later on some of these will be replaced by fairy variants called fetishes. Gross. Then there are the floating Sin Scissors and Sin Scythes. How do you deal with these things? Blast their masks off with either guns or your sword. Later on in the game you'll also come across the Death Scyther and Death Scythe variants, which are just more annoying to deal with in general. Thankfully, they're usually only one at a time in a single room. Once you reach the Coliseum area, you'll come across the Blades, which were prototype hunters back when DMC was Resident Evil 4. Blades are usually annoying for one reason, that being their ability to just tank some of your attacks and hit you despite you still hitting them, along with not letting themselves get juggled in midair. Other than that, they aren't terrible to deal with. Then there's what I consider to be the enemies that really only exist to justify Ifrit's existence, Frosts and Plasmas. Frosts essentially copy your abilities with Ifrit to a T, but with ice instead of fire. Plasmas also copy Dante's abilities in appearance, but if you use Ifrit's Inferno move, it's essentially an instant kill, so there's no reason not to use it. Then there's the last basic enemy I've had the toughest time dealing with when there's more than one of them, Shadows. These deadly cats can't be hit by Ifrit or Laster, basically meaning you have to spam your guns on them until they reveal your core, or bait out their piercing lance move that if you land on top of, you can just mash gun until they start glowing red. But that doesn't mean they're completely dead, despite their health being depleted. If the Shadow manages to grab you while it's in desperation form, it will explode with you in its clutches, taking out a boatload of your health. One at a time, Shadows aren't a big deal as long as the camera works with you, emphasis on that last bit. But more than one at a time, plus impatience health points, and you may be looking at a restart. Despite the unforgiving difficulty of the enemies, the bosses take it even further. All of these bosses will give you a run for your money. Let's start from the beginning with Phantom. Phantom will defend himself from your attacks from a specific point, which means you have to attack from a different location on his body. A lot of bosses do this actually, though Phantom is the one that stands out the most to me next to Angelo. Phantom will also either spit fireballs at you or cause pillars of fire to erupt beneath you. Next in the list of bosses is Angelo, who, like I mentioned before, is the rival battle of the game. What this means is that Nilo will copy some of Dante's abilities, gaining more and more of them until the final battle, along with having a few different moves, like an energy ball or these summoned swords. I feel like those are important.
Virgin, Dante, happy birthday.
Wow! I want chocolate! No, I want chocolate!
After this is where the bosses sort of nosedive in quality, starting with Griffin, which is mostly a dodge and shoot fight no matter which encounter it is, with the second encounter on the boat being what I consider the worst of the encounters. After this is Nightmare, who just has some archaically bad design. Nightmare is a tank that exposes its core occasionally, which is where you really need to hit it. Sometimes the game doesn't let you get on its back to hit the core though, which doesn't feel intentional, and the core that appears on the back is sometimes defended by projectiles that stun lock you and sap your health away like nothing else. You can knock these back, sure, but that doesn't change the fact that it can feel archaic at times, especially on hard mode. Unless it's just cheating your Devil Trigger. Now, all of that I just explained was what you'd experience on the default difficulty, normal. Hard mode makes enemies hit harder, sometimes replacing enemies in certain rooms, and making the bosses even tougher. There's also a third difficulty you can unlock after beating hard mode, Dante Must Die, and, well, common demons aren't that much harder in Dante Must Die, but the bosses... Don't play this game on Dante Must Die mode unless you're a complete masochist. There are absurdly strict time limits. Getting S ranks is even more difficult on boss levels without exploiting some candle strategies like Dragon Candles, and you can barely afford to get hit. This is how many times I had to use continues. But that Platinum and Infinite Devil Trigger costume were so worth it.
All in all, I'd say to recommend this cautiously. It isn't something that I'd recommend you pick up if you've played any other Devil May Cry game, or you've actually played any other action, hack and slash kind of game like that. Even then, I still say recommend this, but especially on Dante Must Die mode, this game can be harder than Dark Souls.
The damage output in Dante Must Die may be a bit absurd, but if you asked me what the worst part of DMC1 was gameplay-wise, it would be a couple things. The first being unable to change which enemy you're locked onto, which is the most annoying when you're dealing with 3 shadows in a single room. Just one has the one that try to light me out, the one next to it! And the rest of the issues being the fixed camera angles that you're forced to deal with. Especially during some boss fights and mini-boss encounters where you can't see the enemy thanks to the camera. In a character action game, you always need to see yourself and your enemy. It's something I wish they'd change after turning RE4 into DMC more than anything else in the entire game, even compared to this Dante's kind of wooden character.
Honestly, my biggest complaint about Devil May Cry as a game is that it feels way too much like a polished proof of concept from a previous game than it does being a fully thought out and fleshed out actual game rather than what it is. And because of that, the entire game suffers. It just doesn't feel as good as it could be. There are some things that are just far too archaically designed, not to mention things feeling like they belong in another game, like the fixed camera angles, the prototype hunters, and the grenade gun.
I'm also going to take a bit of time here to talk about the seemingly one-off underwater segments that really feel like they're taken from a Toro-type Resident Evil more than anything else, aside from the fixed camera angles. These areas are short, sometimes they can have enemies, this considers being the worst to deal with underwater, and you're forced to use an awkward control scheme that never comes up again. Speaking of awkward control schemes, the final boss Mundus has 2 phases. The first phase is basically discount Star Fox, and to make things worse, you don't even get to see your controls. How it works is, you fire at Mundus from far away, eventually you get close, and the biggest damage dealer you have is your Devil Trigger gauge. Fill it up and knock Mundus down with a giant fire dragon. Once you deplete his health on this phase, phase 2 is semi-platforming with an awkwardly placed camera and even more emphasis on using your Devil Trigger. Once you defeat Mundus, you're treated even more of the game's porno-level voice acting, giving an iconically bad delivery.
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
All in all, Devil May Cry, despite its shortcomings, spawned a fantastic game series that, despite some rocky outlooks, had a really good start going for it. So let's see how well that holds up in the sequel, Devil May Cry 2, next time. Till then, take care, have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Ow, my throat. Ow. Jeez, that was a mistake putting that in the script.